I've come back to this film so many times now. It's been this impossible puzzle. It's called Mad Max, but everyone thinks the story is about Furiosa, but actually the character that has the biggest arc is Nux. Nux is Latin, and it means seed, as in like seed that will grow into something. What Miller's effectively saying is that this society is an organism. The war boys are white blood cells. Immortan Joe is out, and he's effectively a cancer.
It's almost like a metaphor for communism, I believe.
Yeah. For sure. The bullet farmer, that's the military-industrial complex. Then you've got the people eater. Well, the people eater is the IRS, very much a Nietzschean Thus Spake Zarathustra arc. The principles of this book may be fundamental to the Mad Max story. It's like, it shouldn't work, but it works. Like a dude with a flame-throwing guitar in the middle of the desert in a huge road chase. But yet it feels like it could have been written by Socrates.
Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly, and this is the show where we are on a mission to try and understand what it means to make great art. Today on the show, I am joined by Mike Hill. Mike is a concept designer who's worked on films such as Blade Runner 2049 and the Dune saga. He's also a story consultant and lecturer on the hidden meaning of stories, and today he joins me on the show to discuss the hidden meaning of Mad Max Fury Road. Before we get into it, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you want even more from me, you can find the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to present to you my interview with Mike Hill.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
It's super easy to look back and go, oh, well, we should have planned better. I don't know. Tell me the best creative inspiration that was planned for.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
My first question is, I was wondering if you could tell me, or even if you remember the first time you watched Mad Max Fury Road.
I do remember, yeah. I actually saw it at an outside, I was in Berlin. I went with a friend of mine who did my website back in 2015, Guillaume. He recommended we go and see it. And I was like, literally like, no, because I'd seen the trailer and I thought to myself naively, I didn't know much about George Miller. And I just saw the trailer and thought, well, this is just Fast and the Furious in the desert. Like, this is going to be terrible. And I went and saw it in a Berlin outside summer screening where it's like a projector on a big sheet. And just remember being like not only blown away by the film, but just the format, like summer evening, beer, deck chair, and just watching this like incredible, like what would be the word, like opera happen in front of us. And I was like, holy crap, like that's not what I expected from this movie. I thought it was going to be just, somewhat shallow. And I just remember thinking, I know that there's somehow a mythological component to this because I feel it. But yeah, at the same time, I couldn't work out why it was working the way it did. Like it just worked, and I was like just mesmerized. So I've kind of been, I've that one viewing was enough to like make me ponder it for like years.
Describe that feeling, where you say I can feel that there's like a mythological component. Like, what does that feel like?
Well, it's like it's this weird, bizarre combination of things that are happening. Because on the one hand, there's this elaborate melodrama that is borderline psychotically over the top, to the point where it's like this could end up being very, very silly. But at the same time, that seems to be concealing a layer of nuance and subtlety of lots of ingredients that you don't necessarily consciously taste, but that they're still in, like, it's like having a really well-cooked like curry, right? You don't just get overwhelmed with spices. There's like hidden layers of other flavors happening because there's like nuance to it. It's not just like, oh, it's really spicy. It's like, okay, well, there's some like different tangs and different flavors here and there, and then there's an aftertaste. And I just remember thinking like, this is some sort of magic here, because this is like, it's like a magician. When a magician brings your attention somewhere, it's so that they can actually deliver the main like trick into your pocket or whatever for the surprise later. And I just remember thinking like, this is some sort of like Miller magic here, because this guy is definitely keeping me constantly distracted with bombast. But at the same time, I'm like mesmerized on a feeling level. Like I care. Whereas if I watch Fast and the Furious, I'm mesmerized by bombast, but at the end of it, I'm walking away fatigued, tired, and I can't remember anything. So for me, it was just like, it was a form of movie magic, overused term, but like it was like the highest form of cinema. It's like, wow. And that's what I mean by I'm still mesmerized when I think about it, because I still don't know I still don't know what Miller and the other guys did to achieve that effect, right? It's like, it shouldn't work, but it works. Like a dude with a flame-throwing guitar in the middle of the desert in a huge road chase, but yet it feels like it could have been written by Socrates. It's like bizarre, you know?
There's a few things in there that I think is interesting. Is one where especially the Fast and Furious example, where it's like you leave the theater, you don't remember anything. One of like a heuristic George uses when thinking about the efficacy of his films or how impactful they are is how far they follow you out of the theater. That is like the exact heuristic that he uses. So I thought that was interesting. I think two, you said something about like something that was like I don't remember the exact wording you used, but it was like a true cinematic experience. And I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but George talked about how the power of, or he tries to make something that's pure cinema, something that's powerful. And I think powerful is such an interesting word when it comes to film, because like you said with Fast and Furious, you get the bombast, but you don't get everything else. And I think what makes the cinematic experience so powerful is when you layer in, when you can combine the bombast and like a deep and meaningful story. Because I think you can have a deep and meaningful story on TV, but you can't quite do that spectacle at the same scale because it's just a smaller screen and the environment's different. And so I think in competing with TV right now, like cinema is moving just to bombast, and it's forgetting that part of its magic. What makes that movie magic is when you combine the bombast with something meaningful. I like to say the reason you care about Titanic so much isn't because the ship is sinking, but because you're watching two people you love try to survive a sinking ship. And that is what makes Titanic so powerful. The third thing, and I won my point here, is you said, I don't know how George and these other guys, and you made a point right at the beginning where it's like you have this like weird zany world, but there's all this like impactful stuff happening underneath it. And then when you think about the three guys who wrote it, you have Brendan, who's like the comic book artist who brings that like zany background. But then you have someone like Nico, who's just so thoughtful. And it's not to diminish like Brendan and his ability to tell a meaningful story, but like Nico is just on another level. And so like it truly is like a perfect combination of these three guys and their skill sets coming together.
It's totally like, it's like a band, right? Like if you just went to a like a musical, like a concert, and there were just three dudes with bass guitars playing exactly the same, it would just be being hit with this one monotone. But if you're going to see like, you know, Jethro Tull, and there's bass, there's drums, there's flute, there's singing, that's what that kind of triad of those guys is like, right? You've got one guy that's setting the pace and the beat. You've got George Miller, who's like effectively the writing the songs in some degree. I know that's not a fair comparison because they all wrote it. But like the editor, Miller's wife, is like the drummer because she's setting the sort of the flow, the beat of the cuts. You've got Nico bringing in some sort of melodic underlying thing, and then you've got Brendan who's like putting in some sick riffs, right? And between all of those four people, and obviously it's like more than four people, it's more than three. It's not just the three of those guys; they're the main drivers. But the entire thing, once you expand that to the entire symphony of the crew and everything that comes with the production, you're getting something incredible. And like, to go back to something you just said about the nuance of it, it's like when you're in a church and you're listening to the organs, the organs, the volume of the organs and the reverberation is like, let's say, an audio equivalent of a 17mm IMAX experience. But if that IMAX experience is just playing loud noises and one bright color at you, there's nothing there. And in the same way, in a church, if you had an organ that only had one note, like it wouldn't be an amazing experience. What makes the church experience incredible is the range in the organ's notes that gives you all of the nuance of the melodies and the various like melodic tempo and changes in like pitch shifts. All of that stuff is what makes it this incredible experience. The church setting, the scale is the immersion, but the signal comes through the variation in the notes. And I think that the reason I use Fast and the Furious as an example is Fast and the Furious is a bit like going into a church where the organ only has like two notes. It's like, Whereas if you go and see like Mad Max, it feels like there's a whole range of notes and you're getting like flowed through a musical like experience. But at the same time, I still find myself perplexed because I don't know how there's so much nuance in the story, even though it's hitting you over the head, that it's like just it's very strange. You feel like you've been, yeah, it just feels like a magician has just suddenly like deceived you into the trick. And at the end of it, like, how the hell did he do that? You know, like when did that happen? You know?
When did you come back to Fury Road and start to really try to like break it down and understand it?
Well, I've come back to this film so many times now. So in 2016, I was working on Blade Runner. And at that time, I was doing a lot of lectures while I was on Blade Runner. I did like a talk on Jurassic Park. Straight after I finished Blade Runner, I did a talk on Terminator 2. And both of those talks, Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, were kind of like, the ideas just kind of crystallized very quickly. And the presentations themselves crystallized very quickly. It's almost like at some point I was watching Jurassic Park and I just realized from reading Young that everything is about the family unit. And then as soon as that idea clicked together, I was like, wait, how far can that be taken? How much can the idea of family relationships be metaphorically feeding a story? And then Jurassic Park suddenly became, oh shit, it's an allegory for should we start a family? Suddenly everything else in the film has a new like layer of meaning. And then the same thing with Terminator 2, when I realized that it's about these three characters are symbolically a dysfunctional family unit, and together they're going to fill in their own traumas or missing components in their own psyches for a fulfilling kind of, you know, conclusion. Then suddenly I can make a lecture on that using the hero's journey. With Mad Max, it's been this impossible puzzle for me for like since it came out, which is nearly like 9 years, where every time I look into it, I find more and more theories to try and justify why it works, but I can't put a full presentation together. Like every time I try it, it's like a puzzle that doesn't fit together. So it's like this thing that annoys me because I'm like, there's got to be a way to explain why this works. But at the same time, maybe it is like true mastery, because artwork, a great piece of artwork doesn't need to be explained. But I have this inner need to like, okay, what are they doing here? Like, how do they achieve this? Because you know, I work in movies. So I worked on Blade Runner and Dune, and I have a high respect for the art form. And there's a part of me that's like, if I can just crack the code of this, I'm sure that Miller had a plan. But then talking to you, looking at the art world stuff and looking at all the resources that you sent me to do with Nico and Brendan, I'm like, oh, no, this isn't necessarily a teleological, like they had a goal and they were just subverting the audience. Like it seems to be a bottom-up emergent property of these three people working together, as opposed to a propagandized, hey, let's make an allegory of this. Even though I do think that there are very much allegorical themes that they definitely discussed, because Miller has, you know, very specifically spoken about certain ideas that are there. It's just there are so many layers interwoven, sociological ideas to do with political ideology, to do with communism, to do with socialism. There's psychological ideas, there's religious ideas, there's, like Miller says, I forget the words he used at Oxford, but he's like, a film has to work sociologically, it has to work viscerally, it has to work in terms of the culture of the time, it has to work in terms of such and such and such and such. And he just lists them all off. So it's like clearly he's making a complex tapestry with a lot of considerations. So it's just, yeah, I think in that sense, it's probably one of the biggest achievements in film, because it's like just, it's so subversive that a road race can win 6 Oscars and everyone loves it.
And I think part of what makes it harder to unpack and understand as well, to your point, it's like there's three guys bringing their own thing, but George also like encourages every single person he's working with to like push the form of what they're working on. Like, so you have those three guys, but then you have like Mark Mangini, who's a sound editor who conceptualized the war rig as an allegory for Moby Dick, and so he's layering in sounds of like whale noises and bear noises as getting killed to like show the fact that it's like a beast in its own right. You have Tom Hulkenberg, who's doing the score, who he's bringing his own thing in, and so it's like every single person is encouraged to like push and go deeper and take their time to do those things. And so not only do you have like a screenwriter putting their own ideas in, you have 3 screenwriters plus everyone else in the entire film is putting their own stuff. So it's hard to find like one individual meaning. But what is your process then for, I mean, obviously, like Mad Max is like a nut that can't really be cracked as easily as a Terminator 2 or a Jurassic Park. But like when you're trying to figure it out, I know you mentioned with Jurassic Park, it was reading young, but like how do you try to like find your way in to figure out some of these, like for lack of a better word, hidden meetings to a film? Like what is your process for trying to uncover this stuff?
There's not really a specific protocol that I'm applying. One of the things that I've found is that when I was in my mid-20s, so I had learned concept art as a young person. So I studied as an illustrator and an animator. I learned 3D animation. I learned concept art, which is effectively the creation of like, it's imagining things that don't exist in the real world, which is what I was doing for Blade Runner, Call of Duty, these other projects. I was very much coming from those subjects with a very literal mind, which is, okay, like I even had a preconceived idea when I was about 20 that to make a perfect design, you just have to make it as realistic as possible so that it would exist in the real world. And it was only around 24, 25 that I realized this philosophy on design is completely a dead end. To just say, well, I'll just make a really, like if I'm going to make a vehicle, I just have to engineer it as if a Lockheed Martin engineer made it. And then it will be the more believable, the more theatrical. And it's actually the opposite, which is that the more theatrical, the more satisfying it is. But then you ask the question, well, what the hell is theatricality? What does that mean? Does it just mean being overly expressive? Well, no, because like being overly expressive is sometimes a massive turnoff to the audience, and it doesn't necessarily deliver any meaning. And I started to find myself going down lots of subjects like psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, just reading books. And then suddenly I found that I was building on almost like a network of connections between things. So like, for example, like when, Jung talks about the process of individuation, he's talking about a universal experience that we all are going through from the moment we're born until the moment we die, the universal journey of life. And when he talks about the symbolic stages of that, the various thresholds that you go through, which we all experience, we all remember the first day at school, or we remember our teenage years, or our first kiss, or the first breakup, or the first time you had to do something that was terrifying. Like those are the universal, let's say, thresholds of the process of individuation. And then you ask yourself, well, why do those thresholds mean anything to us? Like, why do they matter at all? And then you start looking into like spiritual ideas of like what these things mean, birth and death, and how we're constantly going through those processes of parts of us are dying so that new things can be reborn, or to metamorphize between like going from caterpillar to butterfly. And then you realize that most of the experience that you really care about is those most critical moments where you are growing dynamically and you're escaping the trap of your own ego or your own beliefs or your own like biases. And I started to learn that actually the stories that were really resonating with me, I started to go through a process around 26, 27 when I started to realize that no, it's not just about the film is delivering a believable reality, and that's what makes it theatrical. I realized that the film is delivering symbolic ideas through the theatrical lens. So and I designed a lot of hardware as a concept artist. So I loved machines. And I thought to myself, oh, the reason I love Terminator is because cool mech, yeah? It's a cool robot. So then I started thinking, well, no, that can't be right because there are loads of cool robots in loads of different films. So I started to think, okay, I'm going to go back to all my childhood classics, and I'm going to interrogate them through the lens of these books that I'm reading. And the books were ranging, I'll make a reading list because some of the books were phenomenal. Like The Power of Film is a great one by Howard Suber, where he just has it's like a dictionary from A to Z and just takes a key word to do with, protagonist, and then writes a one-page summary of what protagonist is in the context of movies. But then there's other books like Young, and like I mentioned, Young was a big one. I just decided to go back and look at all these films that I remember with such love from childhood and just try and see them as like, what do they mean symbolically to me? What did they mean symbolically to me? And then you start to realize that Jurassic Park hits hard because it's about the process of, as a child, it meant a lot to me because I could see myself through the lens of Lex and Tim. But then as I got older, I started to understand that I cared very much about like the discussions about the responsibility to life and bioengineering. And then as I got even older and I got a dog at one point, I started to think about responsibility towards caretaking. And then suddenly you go, wait, this film works on all those levels. Like, and then I started to think, well, can I apply this to Terminator 2 and all these other films? So I think there's a part of me that and I may have exhausted that at this point, that particular mindset of seeing everything as an allegory for family or for individuation. But it's certainly a helpful start point is how does a story represent the process of individuation? And individuation is the process of transforming yourself towards a higher ideal by unshackling yourself from your own limitations that either you gave to yourself or the system you're in gave to you. And that's where I've been coming at with Mad Max, is trying to see it through that lens. But it's not the only lens to look at a great story through. So that's my start point usually is, okay, how is this about individuation? And Max has that, Mad Max has that, and it's wonderful at representing that. But that's not the only thing that's going on. And that's where I get stuck is like, okay, there's something else happening here.
Do you ever try to look at a film from the opposite lens? Like you always look at it from individuation, but do you think that some of that is coming from like just your personal perspective that you're bringing to the film? So is there another thing? Like, is there another way it could be interpreted?
I think, yeah, for sure. That's what I mean. I think, like, I think one thing that I'm learning as I get older is like, I've always been slightly stubborn that once I get an idea of, I work in absolutes. It's like, it's like when I was a designer in my 20s, it's like, it just has to be realistic. Like it's been done by an engineer, like talking about visual design. And that's a very helpful discipline. That's a helpful mentality to have to build discipline at becoming good at emulating engineers. But if you get stuck with that one idea, then you go around in circles and you don't develop. So then I started saying, well, this has got to be much more about the heart of growing up. And I think that's been a very useful mentality to become disciplined in. But then I'm now at the stage where I'm like, okay, I can't keep treating those two concepts as idols, because then you're prohibiting yourself from expanding outwards to see something even bigger than that. I think that's right now at the moment, for example, I'm moving towards more of a spiritual mindset or even a religious mindset, because the thing about religion, and I think that Mad Max does a great job of incorporating the religious instinct or the religious impulse into itself, is that it's basically saying that if you get to worship false idols in itself is like a very dangerous thing. And a false idol isn't just a leader of a corrupt tyranny. It's not just that's not a leader. That's not like an idol. An idol can also be an internalized belief system. An idol can be a model that you apply to things in order to explain it. Those are all idols. They're all abstractions that you use to explain reality. So for me at the moment, I'm going through the process, and this is where Mad Max has become such an obsession in some sense, an uncracked nut, as we mentioned, because I can tell that there's something in there that is so, and I do believe it's largely the result of Miller himself, even though I know we said that it's a team effort. But I think that Miller, one of the things that's fascinating about him is just that he's clearly a man that's experienced so much from being a surgeon, from working with people who are literally going through the threshold of life to death. And he's like 80 now? I forget his exact age. But you can tell that he's a man of extreme wisdom and virtue and experience. And you can also tell that he is very, very much he's not just dealing with secularized views on things. He's a really spiritual person. And I think that somehow, whether he's done it explicitly, I don't think he has, his energy has infused Mad Max Fury Road with that spiritual energy on a level that cannot necessarily be explained or quantified, which is probably where I'm hitting my head on the wall. It's like trying to explain something that doesn't want to be or cannot be explained, which is like, to bring an idea from like religion in, there's this statement in like Islam that I believe is misinterpreted, which is that you cannot depict Muhammad, I think is the term. And we've been told to understand that is as a threat, which is that if you try to illustrate Muhammad, you should be killed. And I actually think that it's a mistranslation. I think it simply means, no, go ahead, try. You cannot illustrate Muhammad. Like it's ineffable. It's something that you cannot capture it. You cannot bottle it. You cannot represent it. The most sublime things in life can't be represented. The things that we care about the most are the things that we can absolutely not prove empirically exist. Love for a child. You can say, well, do you love your child? It's like in Contact, right? Another great film by Robert Zemeckis, which is an interesting intercut because George Miller was originally going to be the Contact director. Now, I don't know whether this line is from Miller or from Zemeckis or from Sagan, whether it's an artifact or whether it was added later. Zemeckis, also a highly spiritual man. When Ellie goes and talks with the pastor outside, and she says, like, you believe in this God, and yet you've got no evidence. And he sort of turns to her and he says, did you love your father? And she's like, yeah, of course. And he's like, prove it. And she's stomached because she's like, hey, empiricism is all the rage, right? But at the same time, she's confronted with a harsh reality, which is that these important things can't be frozen in time. You can't prove they exist. So that's a very long-winded way of saying I think Miller is just bringing something ineffable to the screen from his experience. And another reason that I believe that is because, and this is going to be seen as some form of be the word. This isn't going to go down very well. I tried to watch the Mad Max movies, the originals. I think they're terrible. I think they're awful. I couldn't get through Mad Max 1. I tried watching Mad Max 2 thinking, okay, maybe like Mad Max 1 was like the prototype and Mad Max 2 will get better. And I was like, no, this doesn't hook me at all. And I'm going to try and watch the Thunderdome one. But maybe not. What I'm speculating has happened is that what Miller has done is he's slowly refined his art form. And those earlier projects were imperfect attempts at what we talked about at the very beginning of this, which is where bombast meets like some sort of spiritual foundation, like that. He mastered the art of the opera somehow through each iteration of those films, because you can see in the seed of Mad Max 1, you can see the ingredients that would lead to Fury Road. But seeing Mad Max 1 is like seeing a really horrific sketch by an 8-year-old compared to like a painting by like that same 8-year-old 12 years later after unbelievable levels of commitment to the craft of painting, if that makes sense. Like, and I know that sounds very condescending. It's not meant to be. It's like, it's the opposite, which is like the guy has achieved through endurance and persistence a mastery of his craft, and that's what you feel on the screen, right? That's the way I see it.
One thing when I was going, because the way I do this obviously is I do so much research from like front to back of his entire career, and so it's like interesting to see, which creates an interesting perspective in watching his films, because like you can start to see the patterns emerge. Like he was shooting Mad Max 1 and they had a budget of $350,000. Like the making of that movie was insane, but like him talking about how a film is a visual medium that should get better with sound. It's not a visual, like it should work as a silent movie. Like that was one of his rules making Mad Max 1, which was also one of his rules making Fury Road. The short quick cuts. Like there was a quote from, I can't remember who was, it might've been the co-writer potentially, James McCausland, talking about how some of the actors on set would get frustrated because George would just do these quick takes and move on to the next one. And they'd be like, what the hell was that? But that's exactly what he was doing on Fury Road. And it's the exact same thing, whatever, 30, 40 years later when he's making that movie. Like he's running into the same problems because people just can't understand how he makes the movie. And so it's interesting to see like the same things keep happening as he's making his stuff. But to your point, it is like a refinement. Like he gets better and better every single time, which is interesting. But the closest one to Fury Road, I think, would be Road Warrior. The second one, it has the big chase with the truck. And so even like, but to your point, yeah, you can like see seedlings. I'm curious to hear your perspective on the third one, because of the original 3, that is the one that people look like as the quote unquote worst of the 3. But it's because he takes some swings and does some non-Mad Maxy things with it, which I also have like appreciate a little bit, right? Like what I kind of learned looking at how Miller does a trilogy, at least, is like, do it right, do it bigger, do it different. You know what I mean? So it's not just the same thing over and over again. And he's done that throughout his career.
That's such a, like, I can, from the position of being a creator, working on things like, like big projects, I can tell you that even working on like Blade Runner, the sense of like spiritual concern for the well-being of the film, but also on a shallow, more prideful way, egotistical concern of what are people going to think of you if you damage this thing. Having gone through those experiences, like I can't imagine what kind of character you need to have to be someone like Miller who comes out swinging with creative risks when like I mean that's why he's great, right? Because was it you can't win unless you compete, and like he's just constantly in the arena doing things that any lesser creator would not have the guts to do, and he might not always succeed, but then those failed steps are like integral stages towards, like that's why I love Mad Max Fury Road, because it feels to me like Mad Max 1, 2, and 3 were effectively like rehearsals that the Fury Road, I can see the ideas of Fury Road in those earlier films, but you can see how they've just been refined and polished, and like just the bombast, for example, seems dramatic rather than tacky low budget as it does in the first film. Like it's just an incredible it's an incredible achievement for him to pull that off over 70 years or 60 years.
And also don't want this to come across as reductive either of like the influence and impact of the original Mad Max trilogy. Like so much of, especially Mad Max 2, its impact just on culture at large is quite immense. Like you can go back and trace like the reason that post-apocalyptic films look that way is because of Mad Max 2. Like it's just, its impact was just so huge. I think you have the challenge of seeing Fury Road first and then going back and seeing kind of like not the greatest way to describe it, like the development process of his talents. So it's like a different perspective.
I'm really glad I've done it in that way, because I came into Fury Road completely with no expectations to the point where I didn't even know. I just thought it was going to be like, Fast and Furious, like I mentioned. So I feel kind of grateful to see that and then be able to go back in a different order. Like it's the same thing that I do sometimes when I really am excited about a film. I will read the script before I go and see it. I did that with Sicario because I was working on Blade Runner. I was like very curious about how Denny worked. So I was like, okay, I'm going to read the script by Tyler Sheridan first, and then I'm going to see how I imagined it in my mind against how he chose to execute it. And that's also a very humbling, but also like really good creative exercise, is to say, right, here's the script. How did it show up in my mind, and how was it better or worse, quote unquote, in like somebody else's envisioning of it? So I think sometimes it's cool to see things in an order that you wouldn't normally see them in.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the things you see in Mad Max Fury Road. And I texted this to you, but like one of the things that got me so excited about this was when we first spoke about this, probably back in like May, I think now, it's been a while. But like you were just telling me all of these things you see in Fury Road that I hadn't heard anybody else talk about. And obviously in the last few months, you've dug even deeper. But I'm curious what surprised you the most, I guess, as you've gone through this exploration process of Fury Road?
I wouldn't say that at any point I've been surprised. I would say that it's like being a sort of somebody that's trying to solve a crime. It's those podcasts you see of people that like not investigators, but just people that try and work out who done it sort of thing, going back and revisiting a crime from 20 years ago. And they don't necessarily ever get to a conclusion, but they find out interesting twists about how the case was how it wasn't quite done right, or maybe there was a surprising thing here or there. I think what I found most impressive about Mad Max is that there's so many deployed subversive like metaphors in there. Like the one that when I first realized Miller was working on like a different level was to realize that the analogy of Max as a blood bag was much deeper than just like at first you think, okay, blood bag, what does that mean? Like he's used, his blood is used to like keep Nux alive. But then you start to realize that he's actually representing the whole of the world of Mad Max Fury Road as an organism. And then you find out that he was a doctor. So suddenly you're like, okay, well, this guy's got a huge vocabulary with how systems, the system of biological systems. So when I heard him speak at Oxford and he said that everything has to be sociological, I was like, okay, why have you used blood? And then you realize that Max is a universal blood donor. What does that mean? Well, he's able to give life energy to anyone he chooses because he's a universal donor. And then you think, well, how far can that metaphor be taken? Well, in the opening scene when he's having his head shaved and he's being branded with his like blood designation, when he's escaping through that system, Miller intermittently does these flash cuts of actual arteries that Max isn't running through a cave system. As he's having these flashbacks of people that have died, if you actually look at the backgrounds, it turns into quite literally an artery, which is like he's a blood in the system. And what Miller's effectively saying is that this society is an organism. And then you start thinking, well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Well, what are the war boys? The war boys are white blood cells. Now, a white blood cell is a cellular entity that has no agency, that has no choices. It takes orders and it will sacrifice itself to protect the organism as designated by the orders given by the organism itself. So white blood cells, for example, their entire job is to be kamikaze, which is that they throw themselves onto infections. But the infection is designated by the larger organism. Or in society, when you have a tyranny, when you have communism, when you have socialism, the designation of what is an infection is given by those that run the system, which is, in this case, it's Immortan Joe. And then you start looking at the way that the character names for these characters. So Immortan Joe is up and he's effectively a cancer, which is why the opening of the scene is that he himself is an infection that has taken over the larger organism of society. And his son, who is the misshapen little guy that handles the telescope, which communicates between the hemispheres of the Citadel, between Gastown, between the Bullet Farm, his name is Corpus Colossus, which is a play on words because Colossus means big, and obviously he's very small. But Corpus Colossus is a play on words for Corpus Callosum, which if you're familiar with biological systems, that's a neuroscientific part. There's designation for the section of the brain which communicates between the left and the right hemispheres. So the corpus callosum is responsible for sending information between the two executive centers of the brain in order to make decisions. What's his role in the story? His role in the story is to communicate between the overruling, let's say, executive centers of the Citadel. And what are those executive centers? There's the Bullet Farm, which is effectively the military-industrial complex. There's Aquacola, which is the food industry. So going to Aquacola, delivering mother's milk to the upper echelons of society, but then going to get Aquacola for the rest of the peasants. There is the People Eater, and the People Eater is a designation of the state because the People Eater is the bureaucratic system that designates property, that takes property, that chooses assets and liabilities for the state's accounts, which is why when they say the People Eater, the wives say he's here to count the cost. And the People Eater doesn't see anything in the system of Mad Max as anything but an asset. So whenever he turns up, he'll literally turn up with his clipboard and say, we've lost this many things, this many people, and no one's seen as a person. And then I realized from realizing that Miller was using the biological system as a metaphor for sociology or for society, I realized that his emphasis on the corpus callosum might be associated with a book, which I know I would put good money on it, that there's no way he hasn't read this book. And the book is called The Master and His Emissary. This book by a guy called Ian McGilchrist. The Master and His Emissary is a book that's about the neuroscience of the two hemispheres. I think that this was a part where I suspect that the principles of this book may be fundamental to the Mad Max story, because in the book, McGilchrist puts out that all of human evolution, all of modern history, and the Western civilization is dependent upon the relationship between the left and the right hemispheres. And the left and the right hemispheres effectively are maintained and run by the corpus callosum. So if the corpus callosum is not functioning for the benefit of the whole organism, it can massively damage an organism's decision-making abilities. So how does that work? Well, the left and the right hemispheres are the masculine and feminine sides of our psyche. And when I say masculine and feminine, I don't mean feminine in the sense of female and masculine in the sense of male. I mean traits. And this is something that I believe one of the reasons that Miller was kind of so like scoffing at Oxford when the interviewer said, so it's a feminist movie. And he's like, no, it's not. It's about balance. Now, McGilchrist lays out that the development of the Western world towards communism and socialism, which is where a tyrant deceives the people into allowing him to allocate the private property of all the individuals and eventually allocates that property to himself, is because of a left hemispheric dominance. And a left hemispheric dominance is what happens when the left hemisphere gets to make the decisions. Now, the left hemisphere is masculine traits. And what that means is it deals in the ordering principle. It deals in, and this is critical, it is the part of the brain which sees everything in the world as things. It doesn't sense relationships. It only senses hierarchies of power as things to be designated and to be allocated. So the left hemisphere effectively is responsible for seeing the world as objects to be manipulated. The right hemisphere is feminine traits. And feminine traits means the relational values between things. That means not seeing things as objects, but seeing them as flowing relational patterns that are always need to be brought into harmony. The right hemisphere sees the big picture. The left hemisphere sees granular details and wants to manage them. It wants to manage them and manipulate them for its own benefit. And the left hemisphere is incredibly stupid. It's unaware of its inability to see the big picture. Therefore, it feels a need to constantly expand its domain of power because it doesn't realize that it will eventually kill the thing that it's surviving off of. And that is why a right hemispheric stroke, which leads to left hemispheric function exclusively, will lead to somebody effectively being parasitic because they don't actually see their relationship to the world around them as being anything other than domination. But everything is to be manipulated, everything is to be controlled. So I believe that what Miller was effectively saying is that if there isn't a feminine balance in the world or a society, you will get a tyranny. And that tyranny operates like a parasitic cancer. And what is Immortan Joe? He's quite literally a cancer that is obsessed with control, acquisition, seeing everything as objects, seeing everything as things. And the major motif of McGilchrist's work is that the left hemisphere sees everyone as a thing. And the whole mantra of the film is, we are not things. And at the end of the film, it isn't a war cry to feminism. It's saying that the right hemispheric traits of holistic, spiritual, relational thinking is being elevated back up towards the upper echelons of society, as opposed to being either trapped in a bank vault, which is where the wives are kept by Immortan Joe. They then go to escape, but when they return, they're being elevated up. And it's basically saying that society is being brought back into balance. So that's a huge, massive monologue. But I genuinely believe that if you were to ask Miller, if you ever got the opportunity to ask him, Ian McGilchrist, Master and His Emissary, he would say, yes, I've read it and it had an effect on me, because the principle of McGilchrist's book is the left hemisphere is at best a good emissary. It's there to be in service to the master, which is the right hemisphere. But in Western society, the left hemisphere has been given such great technological power that it's ended up subverting and controlling and killing the right hemisphere's influence, which is where we get to totalitarian states. All totalitarian states are sociological equivalents of a right hemispheric stroke, which is the right hemisphere is not present in the executive decision-making of society. And in Mad Max, that's the message, is that a totalitarian state run by a left hemispheric dominant tyrant.
One thing you said there was at the end when all of it's Furiosa and the wives are going back up on the platform. I could be wrong. It's been like a month since I rewatched Fury Road, but it's just the women on the platform, right? Like none of the men actually ascend, which is interesting because they talk about Max not going up on the platform, which he was originally supposed to in the George and Brendan version, is because he hadn't earned his place in society yet, which may be a part of that why he's not on the platform, because he didn't reclaim his entire humanity over the course of like 3 days, is what Nico said. But it also fits really well with this idea of McGilchrist, where it's like he's also not on that platform because that would change the meaning of why it's just the wives going up on the platform alone.
That's a really great way to look at it, because I always felt that it was completely natural, and this is a good, actually, so this moment that you're describing is a really good way to cross-analyze this. I always thought that the reason Max never got on the platform, and I absolutely was convinced that it was like that was always going to be the way that it ended. But then to find out that they actually made that decision in the last moment, that he shouldn't be on there because Nico said, well, it's only been a 3-day road trip. That's a bit of a short time to justify such a radical transformation that he's going to return to society. But I always considered it to be that Max is the embodiment of the archetype of the cowboy. And the cowboy is this Sigma isolated lone figure whose strength and value is that they are a martyr, which is that they have the capacity to come into town and see a problem and fix it for the well-being of the community. But because their nature is so inherently, let's say, alienated from normal social customs, they never actually have a place inside of that community. Even if they wanted to, they don't fit. But the burden that they carry is that they are the ones that fix for others what they can never experience themselves. I thought for the longest time, okay, it's a cowboy archetype. But I've never made that connection that the actual symbolic significance, if you see the overarching metaphor of being the return of the right hemispheric feminine traits up the ladder of society, then the ending of these female, the wives, the female spirit, with the seeds of life that they've amassed from the spiritual realm of the mothers of the green place, then of course the image itself doesn't have symbolic salience if there's like a big husky dude on there with them. So I think that's a really interesting, it's a great case study, for example, of why I'm very hesitant now to say, well, this is what the story is about, because like a careful inspection of it, you realize there's so much polysemic interpretation going on. And that's why it's so poetic, because I don't think there is any singular answer. I bet that, Miller probably hears people interpret, like he mentioned when the Japanese dudes, like that when the film got exported to different cultures, everyone's seeing a different thing. And he's like, that's a great story, which is that it's not a propagandized piece of, it's not a demand that you fall into understanding it. It's open to you interpreting it in a way that is relevant to the time in which you live as a human.
And it's important to note that none of the interpretations are necessarily incorrect. Like, we're talking about one very small moment. I mean, granted, it's the end of the film, so it's a large part of the story, but one small 30 seconds of the film that we've found 3 completely different ways of looking at it. And I'm sure there's even more ways that one 30-second clip could be analyzed, and you could do that for the entire film.
Totally. Yeah.
Continuing with the medical metaphors, why is water the heart of the organism?
That's a very good question. I think that water in this context, this is just my interpretation. I mean, we talk about the water of life, but notice that a huge amount of value is given. So water in the film is just called, I think it's called aqua cola or something like that. But the most valuable liquid in the film is mother's milk, which is that it's commodified. So yeah, briefly, the left hemisphere commodifies things. It makes everything a commodity to be traded because of its value. Mother's milk, which is why all the females in the Citadel are used, they're just milked for their milk, is seen as almost like the sacred liquid, which is why Max washes his face of blood with it in the midpoint of the film. I always understood the water to be a sociological metaphor, because the water of a societal system is money. Money and the distribution of money, which is what the state does in a communist system or a socialist system, is when one entity has the ability to print money, they have control over everyone else because they can allocate it to people as they see fit. And what I always understood that to mean in the context of the opening scene was that those who control the water control society. Well, in our society, those who control the money printer control society. So I believe that what they were pointing to is that water is the liquid of life for an organism, but money is the liquid of life for a society, because if you don't have access to money, or you don't have liquidity in a economy, then the economy itself will fall into depression and decay and war. So that was my interpretation, is that in the larger metaphor, it's a metaphor for the financial socialism, which is what we see, in the modern world. 2008 financial crisis, just before 7 years before the film came out. You know, Miller's a well-read guy. He understands what the implications of a central bank system is. I believe that he was pointing or alluding to, when a tyrant has control of that spigot, they can subjugate their entire population in slavery.
So talk to me a little bit more about that. How, yes, he set the society of the film up as a way to represent like a living organism, but he's also doing it to talk about this, to talk about, it's almost like a metaphor for communism, I believe.
Yeah, for sure. So like one of the big mistakes that I think is made all the time is we often refer to the system we live in now as late stage capitalism. And I'm sure if you were to ask George Miller, are we in late stage capitalism in the West? He would say, no, we've never experienced capitalism. And the reason I think he would say that is because in order for capitalism to actually exist, there cannot be any individual who has control of the money supply. As long as one central entity has the ability to generate money, which is what leads to inflation, they have the ability to allocate and take resources from other producing members of society. Because money is effectively it's a commodity that you can control, that has the buying rights to everything else in society. So if you can print money the same way that a farmer prints corn, you don't just have access to corn, you have access to everything else that people produce. So as long as there is a financial socialist system in play, the end result of that will, in its extremes, always be communism. Now, socialism, financial socialism, which is what we have in the West right now, which is where central banks can print $6 trillion and allocate it to their friends, which leads to huge inflation and price increases. That means people can't buy things, they can't afford things, which is what we've seen since the thing of which I won't speak for fear of getting YouTube censored. But as soon as you print $6 trillion, like in the US, for example, you've expanded the money supply by 40%. Now that means that everyone's cash holdings has 40% less purchasing power within 2 years, which is what we've seen, right? If you look at the price of things go up by 40%. What I think Miller was alluding to is the cycle that has been going on throughout history, which is, and this is not a theoretical concept, but the idea of the soft movement between socialism towards heavy communism is always dependent upon the control of the money supply. So I interpreted his movie of this tyranny controlling water to be a representation of sociological cycles. And his talk in Oxford, he discusses these ideas that a film has to be based in the sociology of the time. And he's a well-read guy. Like he's not going to be just throwing in a random symbol that could be so deeply entrenched.
And so how did the three like oligarchs of the Mad Max society fit into this?
So how I interpret it, you've got these three, you've got Immortan Joe, the people eater, the bullet farmer. The bullet farmer, from a sociological perspective, what does he do? He controls and allocates resources for war. Or what's that in the modern parlance? That's the military-industrial complex. That's the complex of who gets funded by the government money printing, which is like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Then you've got the people eater. Well, the people eater is the IRS. It's the state allocation system. It's who taxes people. It's who allocates what is taken from tax and inflation and allocates to the public. It's the person that allocates healthcare in the context of our system. So between those two, between Immortan Joe as the money printer, the man that has control of the spigot of water, the bullet farmer, whose entire existence is to generate bullets for wars, but also to generate the endless war, which is what we've all experienced in the Western world for the last 70 years, is there's never been a period where there's no war, and those wars are generally manufactured. And then there's the people eater, and the people eater is there to extract value from the population, to see everything as an asset, with a spreadsheet. So from a really broad perspective, from an audience perspective, what they're experiencing indirectly through these characters is a broad representation of the larger society in which we live, which is everyone knows what it's like to deal with the IRS. Everyone's looking at headlines about how the government has decided to allocate funds. Everyone's like wondering why there are fires in LA, but there was no money given to the firefighters in the build up to it. Everyone's wondering why there's, billions being sent abroad to different countries. If you're an American, you're watching $68 billion go to Ukraine to fund a war you're not in. You're watching another $100 billion go to the Middle East to fund a war for our greatest ally, but they're not even members of the American citizenry. Like, people are thinking, what is this whole people eater up to? Like, they're eating my value, my life value, and giving it to who? To the bullet farmer. And why is the bullet farmer generating bullets to have endless wars? Right? Well, he's doing that on behalf of the money printer, which is Immortan Joe. And Immortan Joe is doing all of this to maintain a monopoly. So that's the way I've interpreted it. Now, of course, it's an interpretation, but I think it's very clear that if you look at those three figures, Immortan Joe's a tyrant, the bullet farmer generates wars, and the people eater is there to see everything as a commodity to be valued. So that's a pretty sweet, simple metaphor for the most complex thing that we know, which is human society. That's, again, all theory. I might be completely just interpreting this, but I would put good money on it that if you push that towards Miller, he might say, that's not what I was thinking, but I don't think he would say, well, that's a completely insane interpretation. I think he'd say, oh yeah, maybe I didn't think about that consciously, but yeah, it seems to make sense. But that's just a theory.
I don't think he would acknowledge any individual theory as the right one. Because with his intention of it being open to interpretation, as soon as he defines it and puts that line in the sand, that invalidates every other theory and then it ruins someone's connection. But even though this is just your theory and your interpretation of the film, there are some aesthetic choices you've seen that also kind of point to this as well, right?
Yeah. So if you look at and I know guys that have worked on, I don't know Brendan, but I know guys that did like vehicle designs for Max. So I'm certainly not going to say that. It's interesting when you work on a movie, right? Because I'm analyzing these things, but I also know that on Blade Runner, I know that the conversations that you're having within production are not as explicit as this with some people. And also, a director's vision or a writer's vision may not ever literally eke its way down to the people that are making stuff. They might be given guidance to get to a result, but they won't be told, here's the thing I want you to put into this design so that it's connected to this idea. They might just say, can you just do it a bit more like this? This feels a bit better. Like, as an example, on Blade Runner, I designed for Dr. Anna Stelline, I designed what we called the memory orb. And the memory orb was this device that this character holds. And she's in this kind of self-contained chamber. And she's seen as the greatest creator that's hired by Wallace to generate realistic dreams. So that people that have those memories or dreams, they're so indistinguishable from reality, they can't tell whether they are their own memories or someone else's. And the theme of the story was that I saw that whole thing as being analogous to a filmmaker, which is that she's generating dreams for an audience, and the audience is meant to become lost in those dreams, which is, in the case of Blade Runner, the audience is replicants, which is that they're meant to lose themselves inside of her imaginings that she has to expertly craft and execute and visualize. So I saw the memory orb, and this was not mentioned anywhere, as being synonymous as a focus puller, like a camera operator uses, right? Because what does a filmmaker do? A filmmaker, like a VFX artist and an animator and a cinematographer, between the three of them, all they have control of is the movement of the camera, the movement of time, the dilation of time, which is why the object collapses and moves in and out. And as it collapses and moves in and out, the rings, the speed of the rings changes their speed. And it was meant to be a representation of changing the resolution of time, like you do in Premiere when you scale out the timeline and you scale in. So I put a lot of thought into making this something that was a musical instrument so that it felt like an artistic representation, because she's an artist, in her craft, but it's also this technical object that's used that has more connection, not with a musical instrument, but with a computer, with a visual effect. So I was like, okay, I'm going to build something that's relatively like a focus puller. And when Denny saw it, the response was, I love it. It's like a focus puller. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that he was thinking that the design was supposed to connect to the idea that she's a director or a cinematographer? No, he probably just thought, oh wow, this reminds me of this, and that association strengthens the feeling I have for this character in the script that I'm making. So at no point would he necessarily have thought or issued the idea to be connected to that idea. In the script, it was that she's holding an object, and there wasn't even. It was referred to by the production designer as an orb. It wasn't even a cylinder. It was this thing. So the reason I bring up that story is that what emerges or what's curated by the director is not necessarily the result of an order that was issued downstream. It could be that someone sent something upstream, and then it's selective, which is, Walter Murch, the editor for Apocalypse Now, refers to the director not as a creator, but as an immune system, which is that the director's job is to be an immune system for the film, which is that he lets ideas in and keeps them if they're valuable, and pushes bad ideas out and keeps them out. The reason I go through all that is going back to Mad Max, is that when I look at the eventual Mad Max design, and I think about it through the lens of that sociological metaphor of, let's say, the end stages of a political system, which is effectively tyrannical and not sustainable. Well, one of the themes you get in those systems is bread and circus, which is the idea that you keep the public engaged, distracted, and at war. And as long as you're giving them like occasional handouts, and you put on a load of entertainment for them, and you keep them envisioning war as a thing of glory and as a thing of dramatic value, which is what the whole idea of gladiators were for, is to have a theatrical war available to keep the public from rising up. So they were given bread and they were given entertainment. Well, when you see the world of Mad Max through that lens, and you start to look at, say, the war rig when they go out into the desert, and you've got all of the cars are like representations of Americana, but you've also got elements of WWF, which is that everything's kayfabe, everything's larger than life, everything's dramatizing war as if it's a religion. We're on the road to Valhalla. The war boys, all of their religious impulse is being channeled towards this idea of celebrating death and warfare. And you've got the what's it called, the
Doof Warrior, the guitar player,
the Doof Warrior, and he's there like playing these huge bombastic, like, it's like before an NFL game starts when someone sings the national anthem. It's like, Lady Gaga, and there's flames and fireworks, and you realize that actually, in some sense, this is very close to our modern world, where we're given bread and circus, and it's bread and circus. The more a society reaches its end state decadence, and it's on an unsustainable path towards collapse, the more people are fed, the culture is fed to believe in this kind of operatic drama that celebrates ridiculous things, but that takes people's patriotic impulse and places it towards something utterly insane, utterly crazy, right? And what does Max say at the beginning of the movie? Very important line. He says, as the world collapsed, I didn't know who was more crazy, me or everyone else, right? And it's like, that's what the film's showing. It was showing us a pretty damn good representation of what was about to go down in the last 8 years. Because 2015 that was in, and I would say that the world is becoming more and more like, at least symbolically, like Mad Max, as we speak now, like devolving into warfare, bread and circus, totalitarian methods of keeping people in line, either soft form totalitarianism or specific mandated totalitarianism, which is where you take away people's rights to private property or bodily autonomy. So I think Miller was tapping into something there, right? And it's like Jordan Peterson says, I don't always agree with him, but I think he's an incredible thinker, and he says, the artists always get there first. What he means by that is that before people can articulate where things are going, artists intuit where it's going, which is why Philip K. Dick can write a book 60 years ago. And then suddenly in the modern world, you see that a lot of what he was predicting was prescient, or like, Arthur C. Clarke or 2001 Space Odyssey. Like he was writing about telecommunications, where you speak to people through a camera in the 50s. And you think, oh yeah, well, that was predictable. It wasn't predictable. That was a completely unpredictable thing. And if anything, him making a narrative around that concept probably brought it into being. Like, so anyways, that's another massive diatribe. But so the world of Mad Max, I think, is largely, it either was intentionally moved towards being a form of kayfabe towards the military industrial complex, bread and circus, or it just naturally moved that way, where it took all the elements of society, all of the things that we know and are familiar with, the car culture, which is so prescient, V8, taking something as simple as our obsession with the things of cars and making that into a religion in itself. In V8 we honor him, kind of thing, is a form of theatrical kayfabe, as it were.
Talk to me about the individual within the system. Tell me about Max and kind of Max's role as he fits within this, and what his kind of arc over the course of the story is.
This is like one of those, you and I have spoken about this, and it gets like complicated, right? But I would say that the great films, there's not a single protagonist, right? So in Terminator 2, you could say it's John Connor's story because he's the savior, but actually Sarah Connor, John Connor, and the Terminator all have co-conforming arcs that influence each other. And all of their arcs are essential because at the end of it, all three characters have changed in a mutually beneficial, holistic way. And in Mad Max, I would argue that the three protagonists are Max, Furiosa, and Nux. And it's an interesting quirk that with Mad Max, it's called Mad Max, but everyone thinks the story is about Furiosa, but actually the character that has the biggest arc is Nux, right? And
Sorry, not to cut you off. I found a quote. I realized that I'd been organizing quotes to share with you, and I found them, and I was like, I can't believe I never sent this to you, but I have a quote of George acknowledging the fact that Nux has the most significant character arc in the story.
no way, sweet. All right, jackpots. Always, okay, that's good.
For me, the biggest character arc is Nux, because he goes from being a fanatic devotee of the Immortan, convinced that this is his day to die, historic on the Fury Road, and he's disabused life, or the events disabuse him of his belief system, and then he has, and then being someone who has very little time, makes the choice to make the most of what he's got, and then basically relinquishes his own self-interest in the cause of a greater good. So that's a very obvious arc in that character.
I'll focus on Nux because I tend to, as you've experienced, I tend to go off on tangents to like I get fragmented. So Nux, I originally speculated that there must be a reason that Max and Nux are so similar in their conventions of their naming. And I thought originally, okay, this is like Max, but with NU, like new, like as in like new Max. And I thought there's got to be a connection here because these two characters are literally connected by blood. For like a whole section of the movie, they are one character, right? And it's like saying that these two characters are like embodied together. But then I realized that Nux is Latin and it means seed, as in like seed that will grow into something. And I think that Nux I found to be one of the most powerful arcs because, like we mentioned earlier, all story at some level is about change and transformation and metamorphosis, because that's what individuation is to become an individual, to disabuse yourself of collectivism, which is the standards that are expected of you. And with Nux, he was the most broad example of an evangelical brainwashed kid, which is that celebrates his own brainwashing. The philosophy that he thinks is his own was given to him like a religion, and that is applicable very much to any ideology, whether it's woke, whether it's some political ideology, whether it's feminism, whether it's nationalism. They're all just ideologies, right? That basically say that the individual should be in service to an ideology. And what effectively the story for Nux is for him to go through the process of individuation by disabusing himself, not just of his ideology, but confronting the pain of the threshold of dying as a boy and becoming a man. And in order to die as a boy and become a man, you first have to lose your father, right? Now, in order to become an actual individual that's responsible, you can no longer look to someone outside of you as being responsible for you in this world. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have a God, but a God is not somebody in the world, there's somebody outside of the world itself. And with Nux, the story is like the classic archetype of that he realizes that this father figure, Immortan Joe, who he's so desperate to seek his approval, that when he eventually gets that moment where he embarrasses himself, humiliates himself, and Immortan Joe says like mediocre, that's the beginning of Nux's arc towards kind of coming to a form of atonement, like repentance. Because then the next scene, he literally, like, he's talking to Cheeto, and he says, like, I thought I was destined for something great. I got to drive a pursuit vehicle, and and she's like, no, I think that this is your manifest destiny. And what then transpires from that is Nux's journey towards selecting the thing that he'll die for, rather than the thing that he'll die for being given to him. So what he's told is that you will die for Valhalla, and it will be glorious. I will carry you to the gates of Valhalla myself, Immortan Joe says. And then eventually what happens is that Nux goes along a journey of deciding what he'll die for. What is he going to give his life for? And at the end, he gives his life to save the ideal of the wives, the community, the citadel. And in that sense, he literally has the strong, as Miller says, is the strongest arc, because he goes from being quite literally the villain, not in an explicitly evil way, but he is the villain, a naive villain, which is what many people in the world are today as they ascribe themselves to an ideology, to being the savior. And I think that's where the term Nux is selected, which is that it's not only very usefully synonymous with Max, which is kind of a poetic thing, but it means seed. And if you look at the film, there's many references to seeds throughout the film. Bullets are referred to as the anti-seed. Plant one and watch it die. But then when they get to the green place of many mothers, the boon that they collect, that they realize is going to need to be taken back to the citadel, is the seeds that give life, that grow things. And then there's Nux, who is Latin for seed, and he literally plants himself to save everyone else from being chased down by the warrior class, as it were, the other war boys. So his arc is just profoundly good. And Max and Furiosa, I mean, that's a longer conversation, but like Max and Furiosa, you could do a whole analysis on them, but they're effectively the same figure. They're more similar than they are different, which is that both of them, Mad Max starts with Max saying, I used to be a cop. Well, what's a cop? A cop is somebody that enforces rules for society. And what is Furiosa? She is the imperator. She's Immortan Joe's leading general, effectively. What is that? Well, that's the head of the police force. And both of them are coming to terms with their relationship towards bringing order to society. Max has given up on his desire to bring order, which is why he says, now I'm just a creature with one instinct, survive. So he's an animal, and she's looking for to shed herself of guilt and to get back to the place of many mothers. So they're both regressive. He's regressed into a state of animalistic impulse. She's regressing, trying to become a child again. Neither of those two things are good. And the only way that you can get out of that pattern is to look for redemption. And both of them say what they're looking for is redemption. And that means to redeem yourself by taking on the responsibility towards creation again. And by the end of the film, Max and Furiosa see the higher purpose of bringing life back to the Citadel on behalf of a cause greater than themselves. So that's the truncated version, but very much a Nietzschean Thus Spake Zarathustra arc.
Which is something I really thought we were going to focus on. We haven't even touched on it yet.
We haven't touched
a whole other can of worms. But what's interesting about the three character arcs, when you think about them in the context of the system, is like Max starts on the outside of the system wanting to stay outside. Furiosa starts inside the system wanting to flee the system. And Nux starts in the system wanting to stay in the system. And then by the end of the film, you have Nux, who now is on the outside of the system wanting to be outside the system. Furiosa has the realization that the system has value and makes the decision to go back. And Max, well, not necessarily as clear because he still remains outside the system. He himself, I think the desire is I don't want to be in the system to him wanting to be in the system. He just hasn't earned it yet. And so I think that's kind of how their arcs play within the systems Miller has established.
That's a great, I never thought about that. That matches with a woman called Karen Horney, Hornevian triads, which is that in all systems, in all social systems, there's only one of three relations that you can have. You either want to withdraw from it, you want to comply with it, or you want to attack it. And that's, when you look at it through that concept, what you just described there is these changes in the relationship to the system, which is I want to withdraw and be outside of it. Nux is I want to comply. And then by the end, Furiosa is like, I want to destroy it. So it's a very interesting way to conceptualize it.
Before we wrap up, and I'm going to do my best to wrap this up in short order, because I feel like as we talk, I get more questions and more ideas of things we can explore. But you've alluded to it a few times, and you talked about how Nux obviously is Latin for seed, but your original kind of entry point when it came to Nux was him being new Max. So I was curious if you kind of talk about the parallels between those two characters, because I feel like for most people, they might not necessarily see that. So what do you see when you see the parallels between Max and Nux?
It's just very interesting that the arc between the two is that they are very complementary, which is that both of them are tough, warlike spirits, but Max is jaded and dissolved of all hope, optimism, and let's say like enthusiasm. And I mean enthusiasm not in the sense of like, hey, finding things fun, but in Greek, like the idea of enthusiasm is like seen as like a god, which is the enthusiasm and the hope and optimism to do something is what takes your energy into the future. And Max is basically like, there is no future. I have no name. I have no identity. I don't care. I just want to be left out here and survive. And Nux has all the enthusiasm. He's full of pep. He's full of drive. But all of his drive is aimed at something completely immoral, which is this ideological possession. And between the two of them, they literally not only get attached as actually co-surviving entities, that Max is only kept alive because he's providing blood to Nux, and Nux is only alive because he's taking Max's blood. But between the two of them, they are collectively co-conforming each other. And there's some beautiful scenes where Max ordains Nux several times symbolically after Nux decides to transform his life goal from Valhalla to helping the wives and Max and Furiosa. At the midpoint of the film, which is generally speaking, it's almost the exact midpoint, which is where we reach the darkest point and the characters reach their transformational moment. Jurassic Park, the exact halfway point is when the T-Rex gets out of the cage that forces Alan to become a father. The halfway point of Mad Max is when Max says to Furiosa, take the war rig 2 clicks up the road. And she's like, well, what if you're not back? And he says, then you go on, like you leave me. And it's at that point that there's this moment where the characters are suddenly, there's this reconfiguration of drives and goals, which is that Furiosa suddenly looks and she's like, oh wow, like you're somebody that actually is willing to die for us. Like that's your value. But at that point, Nux also is transformed because he starts trying to get the war rig because he's what they call it, black fingers or whatever. There's a term for like a mechanic that he's like, I can help us here. I can get us to that thing there, the tree. And he starts to help them move up the out of the quagmire, literally a quagmire, a swamp that they get stuck in. But when Max goes off to effectively kill the bullet farmer, goes off into the fog and comes back, he brings back all these gifts that are like boons, and he ordains Nux with a boot, which is a very symbolic idea that when you have no footwear, you're effectively in penance. He gives him a boot. He gives him an entirely new persona, which is that he gives him a steering wheel instead of the baby steering wheel that Nux holds up at the beginning with the pursuit vehicle. He gives him steering wheel of the bullet farmer, and he gives him a belt. And effectively, it's this idea that Max is basically saying, okay, I'm not your father, but you are now a new man. Like you're now a man. You're now looking after responsibilities. So these two characters, Nux is giving Max energy and Max is giving Nux like ordnance, as it were, like the armor of God, which is what I believe is what Miller is referencing, which is a Christian concept. So these two characters are co-conforming effectively, that they're in a very intimate relationship with each other as the only men in that group. And that's very important, right? Because they're the only males in that group. Everyone else is female. And, in the dynamic of the story, it's about the females and the males coming to some kind of harmonious balance. But I think that the story would be very different if there was no, well, of course it would be different, but if you've got two dudes there, they have to have a very metamorphizing relationship between the two of them, that kind of masculine bond of brotherhood, or sort of brotherhood, but it's not, because Max is basically treating Nux as an equal, but also as a young man. He's ordaining him, right? So I just think that Miller at some point must have had discussions with Brendan and Nico where he says, oh, right, these guys are effectively, this is a story of a new father-son relationship. So Nux is he's an apprentice to Max, and Max is learning to become a protege again, to care. So yeah, very, like, again, all interpretation, but it's to me, when you look at the dynamics of how those characters are characterized, how they're influencing each other is extremely potent, if that makes sense.
I'll stop it here, because if I ask you another question, we'll just keep going. But I'm sure this won't be the last time you'll be on the show. This is your second time on the show. I'm sure there's going to be many more in the future that I am looking forward to. Before I let you go, do you want to tell people where they can find Know Thyself?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I've got a Kickstarter on the go at the moment. Maybe it will still be going, but Know Thyself, if you go to play.knowthyself.space, it's a game, it's a board game about personality and psychology. It's a 2 to 4 player game, amazing social experience where people really get a sense of deep connection with each other. It's fun, it's illuminating, it's very different to anything you've played. So maybe people want to check it out.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and if you enjoyed my interview with Mike, do me a favor and send it to just one friend who you think would like it too. And if you want even more from me, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes. And now, go do your thing. Whatever it is, do it well.